Americans are infamous for their so-called anti-intellectualism. Yet America is a country with unusually magnificent intellectual achievements. So it's worth to look into what anti-intellectualism is really about. Anti-intellectualism is first and foremost directed against the class of intellectuals, that is, the people who are usually called intellectuals, professors, teachers, journalists, and artists. For example, I doubt that there is any American anti-intellectual who catches his offspring secretly reading a textbook on maths and then gives a lecture about how evil intellectuals are. That doesn't happen. What does happen is that the child gets home from school and the parents hear the teachers talk about how evil America and capitalism is and how they're backed by very smart professors at the best universities of the country. Because intellectuals are usually liberals. That's why down-to-earth conservative Americans don't like them. That is what is called anti-intellectualism. It is merely a special case of anti-liberalism. But how come that the American class of intellectuals are liberal? First, a small observation. The situation in America isn't unique to America. It is very much the same in all Western countries. All Western countries have a liberal intellectual class, and they all have an anti-intellectual opposition, although it's usually tiny compared to the one in America. So the details are different, but there's a common pattern, and the causes lie in psychology and economics. And what I'm going to say is in part a repetition of what I said in my rant, Women Rule the West. First, let's look at one group of intellectuals who are dependent on government money, the professors and the teachers. Think about the typical biography of such people. Grown up going to school, then they go to college or university. At some point, they become a teacher or professor. So most of them haven't seen anything but educational institutions in their entire life. This is important because educational institutions are funded largely by the government, and their funding doesn't depend on results. The teacher will be paid independent on whether students learn anything. The researchers are paid independent on whether they figure something out or whether what they figure out is of use to anyone. In the case of researchers, this is called freedom of research. And when they are doing nothing, that's actually not the worst that can happen. The worst that can happen is that they get paid for delivering theories people like to hear. But there's an even more important thing that the biographies of intellectuals tell us. They are all loners. Both teachers and professors rarely rely on the work of others for their profession. If you've worked in the economy, you will most likely have made the unpleasant experience that the failure of others affect your own work and your own standing in the company. This is because teamwork is necessary, yet it is also important to evaluate individual performance. That gives the opportunity to blame others for one's own failures. It gets even worse if you have to lead people. Leftists usually assume that CEOs enjoy wielding power, that superiors enjoy the aspect of ruling and taking credit for the work of their subordinates. They are totally clueless of how frustrating it can be to be forced to take responsibility for the failure of those you're supposed to be leading. Professors and teachers have usually never been in such situations. In a very profound sense, they lack life experience and are fundamentally naive about human nature. Yet, since the educational system is indeed to a large extent rewarding intelligence, it's wrong to say that they're all stupid. In fact, some of them are outright brilliant. Yet it's still brilliance combined with lack of life experience and being fundamentally naive about human nature. Bertrand Russell, Noam Chomsky, Richard Dawkins, even Albert Einstein. Intelligence is not the only common characteristic among them. They are all, or were all, fundamentally naive about human nature in the sense I explained. This is the force that pushes professors to the left and corrupts science. That's why the professors are the most harmful part of the intellectual class. The honorable title of professor and the achievement of individual geniuses is what gives liberalism the intellectual credibility it has. As for the actual corruption of the science itself, there are two major counterforces that can immunize the science somewhat. First, a strong fixed canon everyone has to respect and that is deemed immutable. You find this on law and medicine. And second, much more effective, strong verifiability. Maths, for example, is a science where everything gets proven. There is just no way to corrupt it. Although Russell is an example of an individual, is an example for how individual mathematicians can still support the liberal cause very effectively. Then the natural sciences are fairly objective for a similar reason. But there are also those sciences that have never been very objective to begin with, and also beg for abuse in their nature of dealing with the human condition, the humanities. And this effect reinforces itself. The intelligent but conformist girl who gets good grades but doesn't have a clue about what to do with her lives other than do good will likely be drawn towards the humanities if she studies. Such an adolescent is also likely to be left-leaning, and in fact, most young people are left-leaning. The reason for this is the same. Their sustenance is unconditional, and they have no proper way to distinguish oneself. You probably know the saying, those who are not on the left when they are young have no heart, and those who still are when they are old have no brains. This is because the young are provided for unconditionally, but most adults are not. There is another archetype, though, the boy that is bright but rebellious with average grades who has interests of his own, often regarding practical things such as programming or engineering. Such a boy will then be drawn towards maths or the natural sciences if he studies. So, while the example girl then often stays in academia or becomes a teacher, the example boy sometimes makes it into the economy, because his skills are actually worth something. So this is why the educational system deteriorates more and more, especially on the side of the humanities, and society creates and sustains a fixed class of liberal intellectuals. The driving motor for this effect is the unconditional funding of academia and public schools with tax money. That is the first and most important group. But not all intellectuals are net tax receivers. Journalists are very often independent freelancers, and they are still liberal most of the time. Same goes for Hollywood. But first, an observation about the media. It is indeed so that government media tends to be more liberal than private media. Private media, such as the countless blogs, are also often liberal, but conservative media is exclusively private. In Germany, this used to be the Bild-Zeitung, a news magazine that has been tamed by liberals since the hippie revolution. And in America, Fox News is still delivering a fight. But those lonely examples of conservative media don't nearly make up for the huge amount of independent liberal media, and that needs explaining. There are two independent effects. In part, the same explanation that I gave for explaining the liberal bias of students and professors also holds for some of the journalists. Many of them are independent writers who do not depend on the work of others and lack knowledge about human nature in the same way. Some of them might actually have worked in the economy but failed. When they then blame the system, that counts as not having learned anything about human nature as well. But this effect doesn't explain it all yet, because there is actually a huge amount of media that is indeed team-oriented and needs to make hard money for them to survive. That is TV networks and the movie industry, for example. For them, the incentive is to deliver what people want to hear. Murdoch is the classic example. Fox News in America is rather conservative, whereas the controversial British News of the Week that just got closed, that network is nothing but a mudslinger. So this force is merely the mouthpiece of the zeitgeist. So what's going on here is the professors who provide the intellectual ammunition and give the required credibility. And then the more leftist media is using this to push the zeitgeist to the left. The rest of the media follow suit to stay in business. And in the absence of a counterforce, that creates the class of intellectuals that is dominating the Western world. I have a maths degree and work as an IT professional. Among my interests are philosophy, history, psychology, poetry, video games, and movies. I am an anti-intellectual.